Bom dia, good morning for those who don't speak Portuguese. Lembrando que a gente é obrigado a usar o inglês por esse ser um curso que reúne docentes do Brasil e da Palestina, e eles também estão muito interessados nessa classe, nessa aula que a professora Mona vai dar hoje, que é a respeito da imigração árabe e da diáspora palestina no Brasil. So we welcome Professor Mona. It's a pleasure to have her in this course. She holds a PhD in education from the Federal University of São Carlos, a postdoctorate from the University of São Paulo, also São Carlos Unity. She's associate professor at the Department of Public Health of the University of Brasilia, and a biologist from the American University, Washington, D.C. She has a diploma in medical anthropology from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and several other diplomas and courses that she has done abroad and in several countries. Professor Mona, she is a member of the Sérgio Vieira de Mello Chair at the University of Brasilia for the issues of refugee and migration since 2017, and a senior visiting professor with CAPI Scholarship in Ireland until very recently, 2020. So it's a great pleasure, Mona, to have you in this class to talk about Arab immigration in Brazil and the Palestinian diaspora. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Professor Arlene, for the invitation, and I'm very pleased to take part of this course. My initial contacts were with Rafael, who is around the corner here with us. And through that, I had the immense pleasure to meet Professor Arlene and to know about the initiative. And it's very important, in my opinion, to be making this bridge, specifically when we're talking about academic settings. And we know that in the case of Palestine, as it is the case in many others, when you speak about universities, academia, we are really talking about prime spaces, very important spaces, where you form opinion, where you change a narrative, which is something highly needed for us in the context of Palestine, the Palestinian struggle, and our rightful, just cause. And so in that sense, I consider myself very fortunate to be occupying a space like that, one of university. But I'll speak a little bit about my background, not the academic so much, but more in terms of my personal background and my trajectory into Brazil. I was born in Jerusalem in 1961, so I was around 5 years of age when the 1967 war happened. It was a tragedy for my family personally, as it was for thousands of other Palestinians, hundreds of thousands. So I did have that experience, and I can relate to it in many senses with the consecutive wars that the Palestinian people tragically have been forced to go through, be it in their own homeland in Palestine, historical Palestine, including that, or in other spaces where they have not been spared from the wrath and from the injustice and from a system that is thoroughly and deeply an apartheid system, which is the system of Israel. So I made my way to many different countries during my years of studying, but I was back in Birzeit at the University of Birzeit, and I worked there, and I had the immense pleasure to be trained initially in Birzeit. So between 1984 and 1992, I was in Birzeit, and I was at the Nablus Women's Study Center of Sahar Khalifa, who is a famous novelist, not yet translated in Portuguese, but who knows, maybe Tabla gets interested in translating her, which is an editor. And then in 92, I moved to Brazil. And since that time, I've been residing here in Brazil. At the moment, I am at the University of Brasilia for the last 15 years. But initially, I was in São Paulo, in the interior of São Carlos. And this experience has been very important for me. We usually say that Brazil is a continent, literally, and it is in many ways, in its diversity, in the experiences, in being a Palestinian, in being a Palestinian woman here, and in the interactions that are held. I spent 4 years outside Brazil in Cambridge, University of Cambridge, and before that, I was at the United Nations University in Amman. And effectively, I go back to Palestine every year. So in a way, I feel myself, because my family lives there, and I have, apart from my family, of course, my friends and my ties, be it on the nationalistic level, but also in terms of pure love and attachment to that place, which is my homeland. So this was just the background to give you an idea, because I will be addressing at some point the experience of Palestinians and the diversity of the causes and the reasons that they have arrived here to Brazil. So I'll start my presentation giving you a summary of the points I'll be addressing. We have that. So the title that was given to me, and I think in many ways, it's a challenge always to have a title sort of given to you, although it was a broad subject, but I think I will be able to walk through with you the different sources that I have consulted, and also the correlations that I attempted to make in order to make a more robust and more meaningful presentation. So the title is The Palestinian Diaspora and the Presence of Arab Culture in Brazil. So basically, I would like to initially highlight the historical presence of Arabs in Brazil, their socio-political experience, and then move on to discuss the Palestinian diaspora in Brazil, which I point out is informed by the geopolitical chronology that characterized the different waves of the arrival of Palestinians over the last 100 years. Estimate, this is an estimate, probably 101, maybe 99, but we usually refer to that as 100 years long period where there was a regular flux of Palestinians. And this covers the Ottoman period, the Othman Rule, the British Mandate, including the 1936 Palestinian Revolt, and between 36 and 39, and its violent suppression, then on to the Nakba in 1948, the Naksa in 1967, and on to the war of Syria of 2012, where Palestinians or populations of Palestinian origin ended up coming to Brazil, either as refugees or as migrants. It's noteworthy that not much attention is given in refugee and immigrant studies to the Palestinians in Latin America, although they represent the largest presence in numbers worldwide of Palestinians following after the Arab countries. And they have played a key role, especially more recently, in influencing the voting in support of the recognition of the statehood of Palestine. So the class will also look at the question from a gender perspective. And I would like to draw parallels in these studies from Rosemary Sayegh, who is a British anthropologist, has been living in Beirut and other parts of Lebanon for the last 50 years. She's a staunch defender of the Palestinian cause. She was married, I believe, to a Palestinian or a Lebanese, I'm not sure. But she fixed home in Lebanon, and who focused intergenerationally in terms of intergenerations on the role of Palestinian refugee women. So the question of gender is one that I would like to address, point out, and bring on board some live examples of what we've been doing here as a community, Palestinian community in Brazil. Next, please. So in Brazil, the presence of the Arabs dates back to the times of the great navigations. This is argued by Salom, who is someone attached to the Arab Chamber of Commerce. And basically, he says the first caravels that docked here in Brazil brought the Arab experience acquired over 8 centuries of presence in the Iberian Peninsula. Its influence in the most diverse areas is present to this day. So the language, for example, a good number of Portuguese words as well as Spanish as well, is of Arab origin. But there are also other traits, other things related to architecture and the construction forms, and that dates back to the times of the invasion, I should say, of the Portuguese of this place, which was not empty, of course, and it was full of indigenous peoples. So, according to João Batista Vargas, professor of Arabic language, he argues from the University of Rio de Janeiro, he argues that we should also look, whenever we think about the Arab presence, we should look also from the lens of Islam. Since even first half of the 19th century, there was the Malay revolt, what was called a revolta dos Malés, the revolt of the Malays, and it referred to the enslaved Africans who were trafficked to Bahia, and there they rebelled in a major revolt in 1935, and they were fought back and they were defeated with a lot of violence, and many deaths happened. And this was in the state of Bahia, in the northeast of Brazil. However, the first official record of Arab immigrants in Brazil that dates to 1874 and concerns the arrival of the Palestinian brothers from the family Zakaria, which has roots from Beit Jala or Beit Zahur. And they arrived in Rio de Janeiro at the end of the 19th century. And they arrived in 1874. The print is so tiny, I can barely read, but that's fine. 1874. And then following from that, at the end of the 19th century, a process of massive immigration from the Middle East to Brazil began, primarily Syria, Lebanon, what is known now, but at the time it was Greater Syria, especially of Syrian and Lebanese origin. So the community of Arab origin, according to Salon, a couple of years back, he estimates around 12 million people. So it's the 9th largest concentration of Arabs in the world and the largest outside the Arab countries. We usually say that there are more Lebanese and Lebanese of origin in Brazil than there is in Lebanon itself. Next, please. So our professor, Arlene, who is here with us, she's the coordinator of the course, is quoted here as having said, the dream and destination of many of these immigrants was the United States, the promising America at the time, economically and otherwise, as well as other places in South America, such as Argentina, and not Brazil necessarily. So she says Brazil was not their main goal. However, some ended up opting for Brazil because it was also a promising place in America, and others came here even by mistake. We hear many stories of people arriving in Santos, which is a major port, and thinking that they had arrived in New York, only to be told no, because the idea was that they were departing from Marseille via Beirut and on to here, and it would be said to them, some of the stories say that they were misled. They were told that they were going to Amérique. So I brought, as a token of that, and Amérique at the time was understood to be the north of the continent of the Americas. So there was an exposition, a very fascinating exhibition of pictures, and I had the pleasure to see it in São Paulo. And the name was Amérique, was given Amérique, which is the Arabic word for the States, right? And the rest of the continent. So it's a portrait of the Arab presence in America. And this was promoted in 2005 through the initiative of the Itamaraty, which is the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Here's the book, one of the books that was published at the time, denoting the presence of the Arabs in Latin America. Next, please. So it's estimated that they began to arrive in Brazil, the Arabs, more and more, with more intensity at the end of 1800, 1870, but really 1910 and so on in the state of São Paulo, between 1908 and 1941, the country received just over 100,000 Arabs, 48,000 of them settled in São Paulo. São Paulo, the capital, and the interior, of course. The Arabs are known to have worked as in commerce, and they were street vendors, or they would go from farm to another farm. And this particular task, or this particular profession, activity, economic activity, is commented as having been one that was very adequate to the nature of the Arabs as being good people working in commerce, yeah? So the flow of Arabs to Brazil intensified, and there were two visits by the emperor at the time. Still, Brazil was ruled by an emperor, Dom Pedro II, who went to Africa and the Middle East, basically to recruit labor. And his visits were not made in an official capacity, but he was in Egypt, and then he went to Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Turkey, and eventually introduced the countries, these countries he would speak about, Brazil. And apparently he learned the Arabic language, and there were publications in the Arabic language incentivizing and encouraging the population from these countries to immigrate as labor in Brazil. So here, in regards specifically to the question of working in commerce, the idea was that his idea was to diversify. So he would get from Italy and from Germany workers. He was incentivizing workers to plow the land, to be working in agriculture. And then he said, but he needed people to be working in commerce. So that was, in a way, complementing the different types of population that he was choosing. We need to remember that Brazil was at the time at the height and still had not. On the verge, in 1888, Brazil proclaims no more enslavement of the Black population that had been brought some 300 years before. So we need to keep in mind that there is what is called many times the whitening of the population. In other words, there was the intentional policy on the part of the government, and in this case, the emperor, to bring on to the country populations that were not Black, not from Africa necessarily, specifically in order to what is called to whiten, embranquecimento da população. Move on, please. Next one. So I'll just pass quickly through this one. I just want to make a point again, Professor Arlene. I'm quoting you all the time, but I thought it's extremely pertinent for us to look at it from that perspective. So what did the Arabs contribute? This is very current. This is very much spoken about, that the Arabs were good in commerce. They had a historical fame for being good in commerce, the Lebanese, the Syrians, the Palestinians, to a certain extent. But then, as Professor Klimeisha Arlene tells us, at that time, labor was still tied to the customs of slavery. The settlers borrowed in the farm shops, which belonged to the farm owners who employed them. And so they become indebted. And the idea was that the commerce done by the Arabs, the street vendors or the vendors who would go from one farm to the other, was that they would loan them. So effectively, some say that the first dealing in credit card was done by the Arabs when they arrived in the farms, and then they would sell or they would leave the items, and the people, and then pass by like a month or some time after that and receive the payment for it. So that was a way of easing the selling and buying process. Next, please. Okay, so one thing that is very important is the naming. Until today, jokingly a little bit, but we know that people had trying experiences and sometimes very discriminatory when they would be called Turku. And Turku was referent, the Turkish, right? So was referring to the arrival. Many arrived with a passport, a Turkish passport. At the time, it was the Ottoman Empire. And so many citizens from these countries had with them the passport. And that lingered on for a while, right? And in specific, and I would like to address this and point out, so there was the activity in commerce, the contribution, but there was another kind of activity that's extremely important, that these Arab populations and communities that arrived here brought with them. And specifically because it was at a time when, following the Second World War, there was political tension in the community, and newspapers and magazines were important to open and start them up and effectively advocate for the independence of their countries from the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, that was written in Arabic, and we know that at the time, a little bit before the end of the Ottoman Empire, but for quite a long stretch, the use of Arab language was disencouraged, and the manifestation of any kind of nationalistic spirit was also suppressed by the Ottoman Empire. Move, please. Next one, please. So we have this. It's just amazing. You know, the first time I had contact with this, this is one of 38 journals that existed, and they reflect the memory of Arab immigration in Brazil. So it was printed. This one is bilingual, but many, I'll show another one, was purely in Arabic, fully in Arabic. And the idea was that it was for the population who arrived here. In other parts of Latin America, they had excellent contacts in Argentina, Chile, and other parts, but also in a clandestine way to be smuggled back to the Arab countries. The idea was that there were thinkers and intellectuals that were developing thinking and ideas about how to attain national independence, and specifically the question of the Arab nationalism. I wouldn't say pan-Arabism, still early, but basically around these issues. So this one, Al-Fayha, which is, we'll see it in the next one, is the oldest newspaper in Brazil in Arabic, was printed here in Brazil in 1895. Next, please. So this is Al-Fayha, and it's considered to be the first Arabic newspaper published. So yeah, I think I basically covered what I wanted to say here. But Osvaldo Truzzi, who's a professor, I know him personally. I had the pleasure to be with him as a colleague at the the Federal University in San Carlos. But he points out the fact that as time passed by and nearing the 50s, these newspapers started little by little becoming bilingual, but also this reflected some sort of depoliticization of the community and hence of the journals. And so these newspapers would bring on items and issues and news that pertain more to the social common. But he points out something that's really important. So he says the language change had to do with the campaign of nationalization during o Estado Novo, which is a period in the history of Brazil between 37 and 45, which, among other things, prohibited the public use of foreign languages, including in publications produced by immigrants. So this is a second reason for which we didn't see anymore the same presence and the same importance in the Arabic language of these journals and newspapers and publications here. Next, please. So the Arab immigration to Brazil lived several moments between 1880 and 1910. Brazil received many Syrians and Lebanese due to the conflict, and also because of persecution on the part of the Christians, and also internal fights between the Druze and the Maronites. So there was a variety of reasons for the arrival of these individuals initially and then their families. This is an amazing publication, which was, I think, in 2009, if I'm not wrong. The title is Árabes Somos Nós, Arabs Are Us. it's a very, very strong affirmation. And it says the origins that Brazil does not know. Desconhece, does not know. And this is an image of a vendor who would go to the farms, as I was explaining earlier on. So, and they were called the Mascati. And Mascati refers to Muscat in Oman. And effectively, it had to do with the ability and the skills to be working in commerce. Next, please. So the Arabs continue arriving, and there are different phases and periods. The Lebanese war, but always related to conflict and crisis periods, primarily 1975, 1990, for the Palestinians in 2000 and 2001, for the Syrians, in the case of the Syrians. And so by now, they're arriving not as immigrants, but as refugees, which is a totally different status. That is, people who sought another place to live due to the conflict and the territory. And because of that, we see somewhat, it's quite recent now, Dilma Rousseff, the ex-president of Brazil, basically, and this was an incentive, because you can imagine people who are aiming to immigrate will look at what possibilities they have. And Dilma, at the time, allowed it for the ordinance of asylum seekers to Brazil for everybody, not just for the Arab population, until they obtained the document and acceptance of their application in the country. So you could arrive here without any visa, without anything, even without your documents, if you were without documents. And then the process of asylum would start. And this means that it became flexible, and this incentivized a bigger number of Arabs to arrive. Next one, please. So just a small, tiny, really, something very, very recent of what is present. The Arab community, the Arab food, the Arab words, the Arab different manifestations of the Arab culture are present. Now, in Brazil, so I'm showing you, for example, the Institute of Arab Culture, which promotes festivals, film festivals. It promotes also the Day of the Arab Community, which is on the 25th of March. Recently, I took part with two colleagues of mine, I don't know if they are here, dear friends, Sonia Hamid and Mainara Nafi. We participated in the second festival on women cinema by Palestinian women directors. So there's a lot about that, but also, at the same time, we have to also be careful not to assume that it's a totally easy flowing without any kind of complication. Of course, there are several points that I would like to share with you here. For example, the question of certain stigma and certain preconceived ideas about the Arabs, namely about women. So the gender question is always there. So it's easily said, you can find this easily in schools, in high school, and other contexts. It's the experience of my daughters, for example, and of other friends that I have, where in subjects like history and geography or other matters, it's pointed out, Arab women, oh, yeah, the Arab women walk behind the men, they are submissive, and different kinds of preconceived ideas also that run through. The Arab men are violent, the Arab men beat the women, and so on. So preconceived ideas are common. It is possible to find them without much difficulty. And the other thing is Islamophobia. So this is on the grow, yeah, phobia against Muslims. There are several studies that have been carried out in regards to this. One important researcher, woman researcher, Professor Francivosi from the University of São Paulo, carries out research on this subject. She herself is Muslim, she's Brazilian, and she brings on rich contributions for the understanding of the everyday conditions lived by people who profess to the Islamic religion and who use the veil, the women who use the veil. And finally, I would like to speak about very, very quickly about an incident which is called a revolta do pente, which is the revolt of the comb that you use to comb your hair, which was a conflict that happened in the south of Brazil, in a city called Curitiba, that had at the time, I'm not sure now, but this is like in the 50s, that had a high concentration of white Brazilians of Polish origin, and someone went, a Polish guy of Polish origin, went to buy from a Lebanese shop owner and entered in a conflict with him over a matter, over the buying of a comb. And the idea was that he had to write him out a receipt and he didn't want. There was a clash in that sense, but it took 3 days. It happened and it was very violent, and it reflected very much on a certain xenophobic feelings toward the Arabs. This was very, very well documented done by a study by a professor of Lebanese origin, whose name I cannot remember now, but I could get it if anybody is interested. Next, please. And now we get to the Palestinians in Brazil and Latin America. So this is a nice picture of the Catan family in El Salvador, who had arrived in 1920. Next, please. So, like, I have loads and loads. It's amazing what happens with us when we start preparing something to speak about, and then you find that there's a huge amount of stuff to talk about. But I will try to summarize, and then in the question part, maybe we can bring on board some of these issues. But basically, I want to take this question, approach it from the following angle. Palestinians struggle in maintaining a strong national identity have been affected by the emergence of 3 similar yet distinct groups. We're talking about the Palestinians as a whole, with the trajectory of the Nakba, the Naksa, the 1936 revolt, and so on. Internally displaced persons, refugees in exile is the second, and the third, and Palestinians who have emigrated from their homeland to countries outside the Middle East. So this third group includes the descendants born outside as well. So according to UNRWA, which is the agency that was set up, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Palestinians are the only people who are in condition of refugee that have their own entity called UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency. And this is not accidental, we know, because of the very poor and precarious conditions in which they find themselves, and the political implications of not belonging, for example, to the High Commission, like all other refugees in the world. So, according to UNRWA, who is a Palestinian refugee? The person whose normal place of residence was Palestine during the period between 1st of June 1946 to the 15th of May 1948, and who lost both home and means of livelihood as a result of the 1948 conflict. So the services, so you can see there's a frame of time with a very distinct definition of the day, not just the month, but the very day. So this is also related to the proclamation, the auto-proclamation, self-proclamation of the State of Israel, of course, and the allies that sustained that, Britain, the United States, France, and many other forces. So UNRWA services are available to all those living in its areas of operations, and the descendants of Palestinians, refugee males, notice males, including adopted children, are also eligible for registration. When the agency began its operations in 1950, it was responding to the needs of about 750,000 Palestine refugees. This doesn't include all the Palestinians who fled or who forcibly were ethnically cleansed effectively from these regions, and as a byproduct of that, the refugee numbers were that many. But we know that there were many who went to other places as well, including internally. Today, some 5.9 million Palestine refugees are eligible for UNRWA. This is a very most recent number that I got. Next, please. So this is quite up to date. One thing that is noted is the narratives of Palestinians living in Latin America falling in the third group that we just mentioned, who emigrated, have been largely neglected in scholarly discourses. They do not fit well into a national narrative that has been exclusive to the refugee experience. Therefore, they have not had much space in Palestinian historiography and often do not meet the category of Palestinianness as defined by a nationalist discourse centered on statelessness and dispossession. Next, please. Okay, so we mentioned that the first wave arrived more or less around the same period that the Lebanese and the Syrians arrived. So the second wave occurred during the British Mandate between 1918 and 48, and the last two were a direct result of these previously mentioned events. Next, please. So I want to bring a saying by an affirmation or a proposition by Noor Masalha, who is a Palestinian researcher and writes extensively on the question. And he says, the Nakba remains a key site for the Palestinian collective consciousness and the most important event that connects all Palestinians to a specific point in time. When we talk about shatat, which is the word for diaspora, diasporic experience, or the exile, forced exile, we really are referring to the collective experience of different people from different locations, from different timelines, and going and ending up in very different and distinct places. Next, please. So these are images of the Nakba. And next, please. Widely known, I would say, for those who are interested in the question. And so the flooding and the running away and the seeking refuge, basically, because of the bombing and because of the atrocities that were carried out by Israel in the different times and periods. And then the reality of the, can you hear me? I see my image has frozen. No, it's fine now. And ending up in tents. So between 48 and 50, remember that the UNRWA started working in 1950. There was a gap period where NGOs used to work and philanthropy helped, but many people were also left without any kind of support. Next, please. More of the Nakba, more of the forcible surrender, the unequal force and weapons and equipment that was with the Israelis, with the Zionists at the time, and the Palestinians also resisting. It's very important that we bring on board this reality, the fact that there was resistance. It was on unequal terms, but there was resistance nevertheless. Next, please. So I also wanted to connect the Nakba, with another kind of movement that the Palestinians are engaged in doing. And that's basically that's been happening since April, the first March of Return. This is the name, the March of Return, to the ethnically cleansed Palestinian villages and locations. And this started in 1998 by the Association for the Defense of the Rights of the Displaced in Israel. And it was launched as a way to go back, to return to these locations, to these villages that were destroyed and where people were forcibly removed. And the idea was that it was an expression of a protest against the Oslo Accords, which did not take into consideration the question of the right of return, which, according to the resolution, the United Nations Resolution 194, was conditional, actually was conditional for the state of Israel to be accepted at the United Nations. So the first movement in this regard, if you notice with me, if you're following me, there was, on the one hand, this exodus of the Palestinians forcibly, and then these people who remained the Palestinians in the areas occupied in 1948, in 98, they decide to set up a movement and do this march and go back to their villages. So every year, thousands of these people, Palestinians from 1948, they number about 2 million nowadays, thousands choose a destroyed village within historic Palestine and visit it in order to coincide, in a way as to coincide with what is called the Day of Independence for Israel, according to the Hebrew calendar, and they equate it exactly to say, your Day of Independence is our Day of Nakba. Next, please. So these are pictures of these marches. Move, please. I see that I'm really bad on time. Next, please. More of these pictures. And more of another movement that I would imagine was inspired by it, that happened in 2018 in Gaza, the Great March of Return. Next, please. Tens of thousands of people. And the idea was to protest against the blockade that Gaza is suffering since 2007 and to reaffirm the right of return. So the march started in month 3, 2018, and lasted for 21 months. Many killings, 215 people were killed, 47 children, 2 women, and over 19,000 people were injured. Next, please. So effectively, what is left from that Nakba? What is the outcome in map terms for us to visualize it really, and the catastrophic implication since the Nakba and subsequent wars against the Palestinians, illegal military occupation, land annexation against United Nations resolutions, international status of occupied territories, in addition to an apartheid rule that extends from the river to the sea, according to B'Tselem and many other organizations. So effectively, we need to look and see, for those who are in diaspora, for those who came in 1890, or those who came in 1950, or those who came in 1967, or like myself who came in 1992, what is left of historic Palestine? What is left of that homeland? What is left of that land which is legally by the United Nations resolutions and all other kind of platforms of human rights? You have the right of return. Every refugee in the world, not only the Palestinians, anyone in the world has the undeniable right of return to their homeland. What homeland we have? Next, please. And how that portrays that reality that materializes in front of us, what does it do in terms of the state building, the idea, the notion of an Oslo, which has totally, is in ruins, totally, not just from now, it was born, I would say, dead, effectively. So let's pass very quickly on this. I will leave this as a reference if anybody is interested into looking at the role of the idea of notion building and the contribution of the diaspora. Basically, Tahir Labad, who wrote this, this excellent article, says basically that there are no elements for one to think about it in that terms. Or in other words, the contribution of the diaspora or its presence in the nation building under the conditions that we live in, with land annexation, apartheid regime, a nation state proclaimed by Israel in 2018, an only Jewish state, and so on. Next, please. And the weakness of the Oslo Accords. And basically the separation of what was left of the West Bank, that includes East Jerusalem, of course, and Gaza Strip, and the blockade on Gaza, and the implications of all of that. Next, please. This is an amazing infogram, or it's made by, I'm sure some of you might know about visualizing Palestine, and it talks about the anatomy of inequality, and it takes as a case Jerusalem, and it looks exactly at all the home demolitions, the historic displacement, the ongoing displacement, land confiscation, access denial, family reunion denied, family separation, and so on. And it materializes crystal clear to us that the Nakba, the creation of diasporas, the exile of the Palestinians is an ongoing thing. We're talking about something that is still ongoing and that will be perpetuated. This is raison d'etre, if you like, of what Israel represents and what it crystallizes very clearly now in a government that's, sometimes when we say ultra right wing, it's as if there's somebody, you know, or some other, maybe the Labour Party is much better, and we know that it's not. We experienced how equal or worse they are in terms of annexation, in terms of bombarding Gaza, in terms of all different kinds of measures and oppressive colonialistic, settler colonialist policies. So I leave it here and we go on further. Please, next. So this is Rosemary Sayegh again, and she says, it was a stated belief of Zionist leaders that Palestinians expelled from Palestine in 1948 would forget their country within 1 or 2 generations. This has not happened, and it is therefore a question for research through what relationships and social processes, memories of the original land, what is left of it, technically speaking, but effectively, like I was showing you with the Palestinians in 48, that reclaim that land, that it's theirs, not only in terms of memory, that original land is theirs. In some cases, actually, they go, they clean the tombs. There are tombs, people who are buried there. Sometimes they plant things, they clean the churches, whatever is left there. It's just amazing, the dynamics and the vigor of a movement like that. So she carries on. What are the social processes that the memories of the original land and the way of life within it have been produced and reproduced over time, more than 70 years. Next, please. This is an amazing piece of work that she has. So, as an example, I bring here 2 articles. First, I'll start with this one, which is the outcome of FEPAL Women's Group. FEPAL is the Federation, the Arab Federation for Palestinians here in Brazil. We'll look at their experience a little bit further down. Was created in the 80s, revived over the last couple of years, and is quite dynamic. I make part of it, and several of my dear friends and co-Palestinians also. And we started with this. Basically, we wanted to publish and write by Palestinian women or descendants or sons, or daughters or granddaughters, about ourselves. And we wanted to do this exercise because it is absolutely necessary that, if you like to use the term of the subaltern, but basically of the originarios, of those whose question persists and insists and needs to be cared and identified and felt and reflected and shared with the world. So we did this one article, Beyond the Common Portraits on the Condition of Refugee and Migration, narratives of Palestinian women about their activism. So the idea was to bring on board the importance, and Rosemary Sayegh speaks about this, what perpetuates a community with a question, with an insistent and permanent challenge like we have in terms of our identity, is the dynamic integration, if you like, or the dynamic integration, of course, but interaction also with the society within which you are, and your children and your family, and so on and so forth. Next, please. So Palestinian women need to narrate migration and diaspora. Who says this is Janini Marwa. Marwa writes in a journal, amazing journal called Jadaliya. It's published in English as well and in Arabic. And she says, the existing literature offers very cursory scholarship on the experiences of Arab women and the roles they play in both cultural preservation and socio-economic integration into Latin American society. Here, the literature suffers from scarce archival documentation, neglecting the position of women in oral family history and their role in the preservation of family remembrance. There is also very little documentation on the migratory experiences of women. Moreover, the challenges Arab women faced in advocating for gender integration in the socioeconomic and political discourse are largely absent from the literature. Next, please. So the second article we wrote is called Palestina Livre in Mosaico, saying 100 years, I'm sorry, Palestine, free Palestine in a mosaic, as we understood that the process is historical in times, but also diverse. 100 years of refugee and immigration experience of women in Brazil. So apart from Ashjan, my dear and wonderful friends, all of them, Ashjan, Elizabeth Hazin, who is a poet as well and wrote a fantastic book called Martu, an old historical name of Palestine, the historical name of Palestine, and the book got awards here in Brazil. It's famous, well known. We would like to translate it in Arabic. Into Arabic, it'd be really nice sometime. Soraya Misleh and Ula Zghayar. So the idea that gave shape to this article is a combination of testimonies of 5 Palestinian women, either born there or descendants of Palestinians, who were forced to leave their homes, their belongings, their floor, their land, to compose a mosaic in which they can be read, not only the suffering, the struggle of these people, but their heroic resistance over the past 100 years, but also what these women have built through words and despite everything, and their daily work, their activism, and their art. Aola, by the way, is a singer. She's a fantastic singer. She arrived some 6 years ago from Syria, Palestinian she is. Next, please. Narrative histories, memory, and oral history have become a key genre of Palestinian historiography, a subdiscipline whose function is to protect against the disappearance of history of the Palestinian people. This is Noor Masalha. The persistence of an indigenous cultural way to tell the story after 1948 would have, I suggest, partially filled the gap left by the absence of a coherent national narrative. And this is very important. And I made a point to start speaking about the Palestinian community in the context of Brazil, bringing on board this kind of byproduct, which is basically artistic, but it's also literally, and it's also it's material to be published in articles. So it's science, it is indeed, but it's also extremely important because many a times we are lost with a version of the history that is institutionalized and that many times leaves the details and the bits and pieces of those groups who many times are not represented in the official history or the official telling the narrative of a people, such as women, the poorer population, not the elite, for example, and we know that this is very predominant in the case of Palestine, but the poorer population, those who come from, not from the cities, those who come from rural areas or the Bedouins. And we have, I would say, maybe 25,000, a population of about 25,000 Bedouins. I had the immense honor to work with Bedouins in the Jordan Valley in Palestine when I was working with the University of Birzeit. Their numbers have dwindled because effectively in '67, many left because they could not take the restriction in their movement and way of life. And of course, in Palestine, 1948, the historic Palestine population of Bedouin origin in the area of Nakba is quite big as well. Next, please. So, and I moved now to portray the work. There are many, many publications about Palestine and the Palestinians in Brazil. My dear friend, Sonia Hamid, who I would expect I'd be happy if she were watching and she can interact as well. She did her master's degree and her PhD specifically on the question of immigrants, Palestinian origin. She herself is the daughter, her mom and her dad are of Palestinian origin. So, but I was selective. I could not put everybody. I wanted to portray specific ones. So here, this is Isa Musa Hazin, originally from Bethlehem, a good friend, and he's the brother of Elizabeth Hazin as well. And he wrote about the immigrants, the Palestinian immigrants, and whose identity he looks at and identifies as being Brazilian. So he wanted to understand the process and the transformations that happen. He did his thesis, his master's thesis in 2016 at the University, Federal University in Pernambuco in the north. His family arrived, so he's like third or fourth generation, I'm not sure, arrived quite early. But he wanted to understand what happened, because at some point, little by little, especially in the case of, in his case also, the family is Christian, so the integration was easier, and the intermarriage also with Brazilians was quicker to happen, on the whole, not everybody, of course. But basically, he wanted to look through ethnographic reports at the children of early immigrants, and he will have, and he pointed out that they had been assimilated. Everyone already felt Brazilian and behaved like Brazilian, and nothing more connected them to Palestine. However, he reports also that there was a resurgence of the ethnicity and the identity among grandchildren and great-grandchildren whose parents had already been assimilated. And so he looked in his thesis at what were the reasons and what were the causes that brought on. It is very possible that this is connected to the scenario and the solidarity that was given to Palestine, be it during the period of Sabra and Shatila, where there was a huge outcry worldwide, or during the Intifadas and so on and so forth. So it is very likely that this will have reflected in terms of sort of a rallying, a solidarity for the Palestinian people due to atrocities and catastrophes that were happening to them because of the colonialism of Israel. Next, please. So now we get to what one can call, and my belief is that we should always mix the two. So we have the institutional memory, we have the one that is represented through organizations, but we also have the individual, as I was saying, the narrative that Rosemary Sayegh and Noor Masalha make a point to tell us not to forget about their importance, their value, and how important they are in instituting really perpetuating this Palestinian identity and also activism on the part of the community. So here we start with the Palestinian Diaspora in Brazil, FEPAL, which is the Federation for the Arab Population, Trajectories, Claims and Developments. This is a thesis, a master's thesis by Luciana Garcia de Oliveira, and she defended it in 2017, but it's just fabulous. This is really nice work, because then she brings on board how the Palestinian community sided itself, and this is a point in case here with the picture, when they were protesting for re-democratization of Brazil at the time of dictatorship, the military dictatorship in Brazil. So she says the Palestinian presence in Brazil dates back to the 19th century, and even in the midst of military dictatorship, as in this case, combined the defense of the cause of the community and the mobilization around the re-democratization of the country. We'll see this in other contexts like Chile, for example. Chile formed in the early 80s a party of itself, a party called Palestinian Liberation Party, something of the sort. I have to look it up, but it's just amazing. And it's a leftist group, and they worked for quite a long period of time in terms of reinforcing and pushing their country, Chile in the case, to side with Palestine and to oppose the policies of Israel. Next, please. So she also reinforces the idea that it was the Zakaria family who arrived. My bet is that they were somewhere else. They probably were in Salvador, where it's very known. I've just been to Colombia now in a meeting for 11 communities from 11 countries, Palestinian communities, and the mother of pearl is just absolutely beautiful. They not only import it from Bethlehem, they actually make it there. So my bet is that they were probably somewhere, maybe Peru or somewhere, and then they arrived in Brazil, but maybe not. So, can we move, please? This is repeating a little bit what we've just covered. Yes, next. Yes. So until then, the 60s, something like that, maybe the 70s, until then the Palestinians remained dispersed. throughout the vast national territory of Brazil, without any physical entity and representation of the organization. And in the 80s, in the height of the civil demonstrations of Direitas Já for the redemocratization, the Palestinian Arab Federation of Brazil was finally founded, and the aim was to unify and to politicize the Palestinian diaspora in Brazil. On that occasion, Palestinians and Brazilians of Brazilian origin took advantage of the political effervescence in the big Brazilian cities to present the history of Palestine and the importance of the cause. And so that gave more and more depth to the involvement. Now, with the massacres of Sabra and Shatila in 1982, as I was referring to, this gave a big support and many more people rallied. Here it talks about a demonstration that gathered 10,000 people in São Paulo in September 1982. Next, please. Also, there is an entity which continues. FEPAL still exists, and Sanaoud, which is an Arabic word for we shall return. It's a cultural association that was small at the time, 200 young people of Palestinian, Syrian, and Lebanese origin, and this is the interesting point about it. And the following year, during the FEPAL Congress in 1983, there was an expansion of the association of Sanaoud, and together they started rallying and bringing on board other associations from different parts of Brazil. So that's the South, Maringá, Foz do Iguaçu, Cuiabá, the center, the north, Recife, Porto Alegre. So the success of the public demonstrations for the Palestinian cause encouraged young people from the Arab Palestinian community to found organizations. So it was caused really by this rallying. Can we move, please? Around an event, a catastrophic event, in the case, the massacre. Along these lines, in '84, the largest Congress of Palestinian communities in Latin America took place, organized by FEPAL, allied with the Sanaoud and the Palestinian Club of Chile. At the end of this great meeting, the Confederation of Palestinian Communities of Latin America and the Caribbean, COPLAC, was formalized. So in '85, Sanaoud youth promoted the first meeting of Arab Palestinian youth from Latin American countries, who actually, and it took place in Unimepe, which is in the interior, in Piracicaba, interior state of São Paulo. And many would go as delegations, not only as young people, as youth, but also on specific missions that are government-tied, like in health and in sports and other activities. All these events in the midst of the military dictatorship were organized with caution and great skill. This is a saying of the author, the one who defended her thesis, master's thesis, who wrote her master's thesis, and I'm quoting her, as all of them were attended by Palestinian leaders, leftist political parties, and some representatives of the military regime. Move, please, next. The intensity of Palestinian political cultural activities lasted until the end of the 80s. And also in the late 80s, early 90s, FEPAL drastically reduced its activities. One important factor was the frustration generated by events after the Oslo peace accords. The expansion, the big frustration, of course, the expansion of Israeli settlements in total disaccord with what was understood to be the turning viable a Palestinian state. None of that happened from the start. And the expansion of Israeli settlements in occupied territory and the increase of violence against Palestinians, this led to some kind of dismay. And here there is an interesting mention about collaboration or cooperation between Arab Palestinian community and the Jewish left group in Brazil, namely in São Paulo, it appears. Next, please. So the revival of debates on this is following Oslo, right? So on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will occur later in the 2000s on the occasion of the second Intifada, known as Intifada of Naksa, faced with a new cycle of violence in Israel and in the occupied territories. One of the Jewish leaders in São Paulo, a member of the Shalom Achshav movement, which I think means peace now, wrote a manifesto in the newspaper Estado de São Paulo in favor of peace in the region and in repudiation of the actions of the Prime Minister at the time, Sharon. As soon as the signature of the FEPAL secretary was noticed on the manifesto, there was a quick rapprochement between FEPAL and that movement. Next, please. November 2011, there was the first meeting of solidarity within the Palestinian people held at the National School, Florestan Fernandes in São Paulo, which is a teaching institute for the landless rural workers movement. This is the largest in Brazil, in Latin America, workers movement, rural workers movement called MST, Movimento Sem Terra, landless. And the program and the topics discussed were based on some points of convergence between the audience, formed mainly by the Brazilian Palestinian rural workers, because the idea was to bring them together and to discuss both experiences in a kind of an interchange, or an exchange, such as the defense of peasants, rural workers, the land, of course, fishermen, Bedouins, who have lost their right and access to land, water, and work since the beginning of the Israeli colonial occupation, really, since 1948. The meeting between the Palestinian diaspora in Brazil and the Palestinians later culminated in what was considered the most important one, organized by FIPAL, which is one of the organizers, of course, because this was a worldwide event, the Free Palestine World Social Forum, but namely incentivated and formulated, I would imagine, by FIPAL. Next, please. So this is a beautiful image of the brigadas, what we call, Ghassan Kanafani Brigade. Since 2011, from Brazil, every 2 years, there is a brigade that's organized to participate in the olive harvest campaign in Palestine. And present are many internationalists, and the idea also is to tell the Palestinians that they're not alone. Solidarity is important in that respect. So it's a moral, a spiritual kind of reinforcement in that regard, but it's also a very special experience, I'm sure, for those who go to do that solidarity. And specifically, the brigade works with the Union of Agricultural Work Committees. It's a peasant movement, Palestinian peasant movement, and they exchange learning, or there is an experience in learning about other experiences, political and organizational resistance in Palestine. Next, please. And finally, this is not to say that the thing finished, but my presentation finishes here, and then we can look at other dimensions. But in 2012, due to the vote on the application filed by the Palestinian Authority for the formal recognition of the Palestinian state in the 1967 borders at the UN, there was in Brazil, more specifically in the city of Porto Alegre, the first thematic World Social Forum. The Free Palestine World Social Forum brought together groups, movements, political parties, and national and international NGOs in support of the recognition of the state of Palestine. So this is the motto, World Social Forum, Free Palestine, Porto Alegre, a city in the south of Brazil. And it's considered as an event that symbolized the translation and translated, so it symbolized and translated the empathy of the Palestinian people towards the suffering, the Brazilian people towards the suffering of the Palestinians, and above all, the integration of the Palestinian diaspora into Brazilian society. Next, please. So this is the bibliography, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Muna. It was a pleasure to have you here. And as I like to say, it's very inspiring to have all of you guys speaking to us and bringing us these perspectives that are so important for us and for people interested not only in Palestine, but also Middle East in general, and these transnational movements and everything. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. So now we are going to go to the Q&A, and we have some questions. And the first one I want to make is by Yasmini Nardi, And she asks, could you recommend some specific spaces of archival research on images of the Arab diaspora in Brazil?
Yeah.
Do you want to answer one by one, or
Yeah.
do you want
Yeah.
me to? Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I misunderstood you. Okay, I'll answer this one and then we can move to another one. An excellent reference is the Institute of Palestine Studies. It's on the website. Yeah, they not only do they carry publications, but they've recently, a couple of months ago, they've announced the payment of, if I'm not mistaken, $200 for people to record their memory and their narrative. But before that, they carried out workshops to help people know how to narrate. You can understand, everybody can understand that the experience of war is traumatic. Being exposed to war is something extremely traumatic. And most of the time it remains a family or a clan, if you like, a wider family kind of issue and not so much shared. So they did this in order to encourage people and to give them the tools of how to do that, right? So the Institute of Palestine Studies is a wonderful place. This is something that exists, I think, since 1965, and it's a treasure for us who research. For us as a Palestinian, I'm very proud of this space. Other places like Palestine Remembered, for example, and they rely on this idea that I was saying, the oral history, the narrative, which is something that's not as, let's say, as valued or as present, as dominant as is the institutionalized or the version that is considered as the official version. So you will find plenty of archives, many images. Here in Brazil, Icarabi they initiated, I think they're still on that. They have really some wonderful resources. And of course, if you are in São Paulo, go to the Museo do Migrante. I think that's the name. Is that the name, Raful? Museo do Migrante, yeah? It's a beautiful place and it's digitalized and very well kept. So yeah, these are the places I have in mind, I can think about where you can look. But if you get to the Institute of Palestine Studies website, you'll find lead you to other resources. So it'll take you from one to the other and you'll be doing some snowballing, if you like, in terms of getting access to other ones.
That's amazing. There's another one in Curitiba. It's not that big as the one in São Paulo, for example, but
yes.
It's the Memorial Árabe. And for those who are eventually in Curitiba or around the south and have access to the city somehow, also there's this reference that can be mentioned. There's some interesting questions here, and I would like to, before getting to the question, just maybe make my own question of my own, and then bring it to the question. So a good part of the community of Palestinians in Latin America also, I wouldn't say flew, but went to Latin America before 48, and there's a huge community from Bethlehem and surroundings, Bejala and Bet Sahur. And I've read some articles a few years ago about how the Palestinian case or Palestinian question or Palestinian cause also is informing the construction of a new expression of identity. Okay, so like people who have Palestinian family, but they never related themselves as Palestinians or Arabs, but when they get access to the question of Palestine, or they try to just visit Palestine, then they were denied the entrance. Then they discovered and they built this identity, or they started to act.
Reclaim.
Exactly. So this is really interesting. I'd like to you to comment on this thing, And this leads us to the question of Julia Lobo. Do you see any changes in the Brazilian population's perceptions of the Palestinian struggle of the time? And also, I would like maybe put both questions together, like how the Brazilian population see the struggle towards time, and how the Palestinians themselves see this being abroad, in Brazil, of course.
Wow, these are complex questions, but let's see. The response will be also complex, so it means it will be incomplete. Um, I agree with you on this thing, Rafael, with regards to the expressions, the different expressions of identity. And one of the things that Marwa, whose article is in Jadalia, I think I have it in the bibliography, she refers to as the long distance nationalism. And we need, yeah, so it's interesting, you know, how do you develop this, and how do you sustain it and maintain it, in what circumstances? So I don't have many elements to say to you, apart from the fact that it is something that has been, there's a term that has been coined to describe it as a long, with regards to Latin America in specific, vis-a-vis the Palestinian community. So it's long distance nationalism. So perhaps we can start exploring it from this perspective. And perhaps it's sufficient to be long distance. I mean, who says necessarily, I contest, that you have to go to the country in order to feel for it, solidarize, and, you know, everything else. I have some Brazilian friends who are staunch defenders of the question of Palestine, and, you know, without having had neither the experience, I understand we're talking about ones who have family ties and history and all of that. But still, I found it fascinating, this idea of long distance nationalism. She's specifically talking about the experience in Chile, with the formation of a political group that existed, a left-wing political group. It's in that article that I have in the bibliography. It details it a little bit more. So the making of that. I think it's totally natural. I'll tell you something, Rafael, and I say this to everybody. I am totally comprehensive of what is seen on the outside and what has been described, very unfortunately, as being the inactive Palestinian community. I've heard this so many times. It's painful, it's incorrect, and it's unjust and unnecessary, totally unnecessary. And this is me talking, having lived in Paris, in France, in the United States, and in England. So I know that there are many similarities. What is experienced by the communities many times is a silenced process of an overburdened identification that really te atravessa, that crosses your way when you are a child, as being, you know, named or bullied in one way or the other. I don't know necessarily bullied, but certainly discriminated against when you are an adolescent, and so on and so forth. So with all the richness that we part from regarding the presence of the Palestinians or the Arab community in general in Latin America, we need to face the fact that there is discrimination. There used to be much more, but there still is. It's there, you know, it prevails, it's there waiting for the moment to sort of come through strong, and many times in not so kind ways. I find myself, I'll give a quick example, and I know that there are many others of other people, but I find myself many times when I present myself, I'm Palestinian, I work at the university, I teach at the university, and people say, you teach Arabic? And I'm like, no, I would love to, I love Arabic, but I'm a biologist. And it's like, you know, they don't associate the two things. Never, ever did anybody, you know, come through with another kind of proposition. So I teach Arabic, that kind of thing. And then you drive, really? Can you drive a car? And so on. These are the things that we come across. But I think the identity takes the time it takes, the form and the shape it takes. I'm totally comprehensive. I think we need to be, and more importantly, Rafael, and you know this, much of the time there is, and we face this when we voted a motion against the collaboration with apartheid Israel at my university, there were students with us of Palestinian origin who said, Muna, I cannot carry through because if my name becomes public, it will affect my family. I don't know how it's going to be in Palestine. I don't know if I'm going to be allowed in, all different kinds of restrictions. The same applies to me. I mean, we run the risks. We don't know what's going to happen. You just go there, arrive in the airport, and see what's going to happen. But you never know. And you know this, Rafael, right? You could be turned back, and that's nothing compared to the people who are in prison, who are tortured, and, who suffer everyday life. So being turned back on the airport is no big thing. But when it has repercussions, this is my evaluation, but when it has repercussions on families, we need to understand it in this setting. So I'll stop here. The question from Roberta, is that the name of the person who made the question?
Yeah.
I cannot see.
Julia Lobo.
Julia, and she asked about if I perceive any kind of change of perception of the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Yeah?
No, yeah, the perception of the Palestinians is struggle of the time, considering the Brazilian population. The Brazilians, how do you see this? If the Brazilians are changing
we are faced. Yeah, we have been faced since I arrived in '92. I think that, and I'm going to address it from this perspective because it has deep repercussions in terms of the everyday dealing, and in terms of political, more complex issues that have to do with siding with Israel, and that's to do with the evangelical churches in Brazil and the growth of those, and the fact that the majority are from the low-income population, or from the population at large in Brazil, which is low income or very, very low income. And that has repercussions, yes, indeed. I mean, the platform of discussion, the platform of conversation changes totally. So from the start, yeah. So in many ways, this was, totally, rally. During Bolsonaro's time, this meant, the most flagrant manifestations of pro-Israel and against Arab. And this was quite a blow. This was quite strong for us. And it translated into military accords. It's not just something en passant. It has deep implications, serious ones and grave ones. So I don't know to situate it historically. It depends, I think, also on the political position vis-a-vis the Israel in particular, and the question. The right is on the rise. We cannot say that it has disappeared because Lula is here now, not only in Brazil, but in all of Latin America, in all of the world, actually. So we need to look at things through this prism, yeah, and to analyze it in that sense. On the other hand, growingly, you will find places that research the question of Palestine. Still very little. I would say we don't have any critical mass, as we say, sufficient. It's good, it's not bad. There is a number of them. But I had two students coming to me and saying, look, I can't find supervisors because I go to speak in my department and they tell me, I don't research Palestine, I research Israel, but not Palestine. And these are like social sciences and humanities and so on. So I think we have still a way to go. I think my evaluation is that what is permanent, what does not change, is not altered, is the gender question. It has not. It has not improved, So I face situations of leftist feminists with a Eurocentric view and approach and dealing with me and with other women, Palestinian women. So we have a long way to go. And one always says the experience of the immigrant and of the refugee is very much the experience is very much a reflection. I wouldn't say a mirror, but it's a reflection. It's heavily influenced by the hosting country. Many times you don't even think about it. You keep on thinking, they don't know how to do this. They've come, they do this and that. I'm speaking about the immigrants more in general. And you don't think, but what kind of a society you have arrived to? As in the example of Revolta do Painte that I mentioned. It reflected this one, yes, mirroring exactly what there was in Curitiba and why it was possible to have a rebellion over a home for 3 days. It went on for 3 days because of course, the socio-political, socio-economic situation encouraged that. But we always need to ask the question, what kind of society is hosting, receiving, yeah? And that has many implications. Just to close on this note, in the countries that I mentioned where I lived, the Arabic language is almost always synonymous of being taught in the family that migrate. This is not the case in Brazil. This is the minority do that, and for what reasons I cannot say. I have some ideas, but I cannot say in absolute terms. What was the next question?
So I think that was the last one, but this subject is absolutely interesting. As we also are talking for a good time, and also Professor Arlene is pretty aware of this discussion that we are bringing now, is to try to make it closer, the discussions about Palestine inside of Brazilian academia. Because we have a number of productions that only a few people that are actually able to advise, to orient it,
Supervise, yeah.
Supervise, yes, students and researchers and this and that. And this is interesting because also what eventually we can perceive is like, even though some of these words are very supportive of Palestine and very critical of the Orientalism, but sometimes not even intentionally, but it can fall into a kind of generic image of Palestine, that it's important because it highlights the question of Palestine, but not always like we can reach deeper things that are actually as important as the main subject in this sense. And but at the same time, we are seeing this brings me to the next question that is made by Ana Julia, and it's pretty interesting because we see also inside the left movements and their presence inside the universities in Brazil, the Palestinian flag as a flag to be supported, to be close to, and everything. And she says, recently we are seeing our academic institutions in Brazil establishing relations with Israel and its genocidal politics. And at the same time, the students have been strongly mobilizing themselves against it. So as we saw recently. So why do you think, in the sense that our institutions are far from the community demands on that matter? Do you perceive something like kind of resistance when it comes to Palestine in terms of institutional relations and this and that?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it primarily has to do with the fact that Israel has a potent, a powerful machine of propagating itself as, and probably it is, according to the measures of publishing articles and all of that. It's at the forefront, and therefore you are, collaborating with the Center of Excellence in Science. These are the keywords, that ring very well, and that, people want to take them on board because they think it will rub on me, this excellence will come to me automatically. So you can imagine that there is a pressure on that, because Israel is a country that receives $4 billion annually. $4 billion annually. And there is a flux of money and money laundering. These are no secrets. Money laundering, security companies, espionage, all sorts of things that Russian mafia, even Palestine, Rafael, people say Russian mafia, had the Russian mafia. So money laundering, all different kinds of things. So we're talking about, and if you like, an exceptional state in that sense. And I'm going to draw the parallel with South Africa, because apartheid South Africa was exactly that. My dear friend Farid Ishaq, whom we interviewed, he's a professor from the University of Johannesburg, and he's a militant on the question of Palestine. Amazing. By the way, I don't know if you've seen these pictures of the young people climbing the wall in order to get to Al-Aqsa, and there is writing in English on the wall. This is his poem. His poem was written all over the wall in support of the question of Palestine. So he speaks about the experience in South Africa, and he says there was a list of at least, 10 inventions that were done by apartheid South Africa, open heart surgery, but we know that the circumstances were of pure racism. They were operated, the experimental science was done on the South Africans, the black South Africans. So what science do we want? Do we want a science that is ethical, a science that really benefits humanity, or just a shining science, which in certain fora, the plural of forum, certain fora, it's considered to be the norm. I want to become this, but at the expense of what? So the security, this is well established. All the security advances that Israel has as technology are experimented in Gaza, in the prisons, against the Palestinians in Jerusalem, everywhere. So this is the main question. And we as academics of conscience, we need to ask ourselves, what kind of science do we want? Well, it's a simple question. And this was at the heart of what happened with BDS in South Africa, boycott and disinvestment. You have to make this question. Who benefits from this science? Who's injured by it? Who's affected? Whose lives intergenerationally ends up suffering because of that science? And the other question, can we make it differently? Can we make this brilliant, fantastic science ethically? We can. Yes, we can. Yeah. So I think the administration falls in this trap. It's not a simple trap. It's not one that one can easily escape. So we have to be robust. I'm saying those who oppose this and want to make it clear. And in many ways, it's a process of conscientizing. I had this experience, for example, with the Council of Representatives in my university of professors. And we did this campaign against collaboration with Israel. And one of them in a meeting, it was a reduced meeting, it was just for a closed group. He said, I know nothing about this question, but I know that you Palestinians didn't want peace and all of that. And I said, give me time to explain. So there was time reserved for me, 45 minutes, in the following meeting. And I brought a presentation with pictures and images and all of that. And when the voting came, it was overwhelming. Over 80% voted against collaboration with Israel. So what I'm saying is that, the media is totally Zionist, is totally pro-Israel, and we need to make that extra effort. Sometimes it's in small steps. At the same time, there are different forms of doing things. In my university, the University of Brasilia, this is the path I followed. But I know that at Unicamp, for example, there was a more forceful way of demanding, putting down the demand. So it's valid, whatever context there is, and that needs to be confronted, and questioned. It has to be done. I'm going to point out something that is really important. We sit in a very privileged situation in Brazil, in the public universities, vis-a-vis this question, compared to the setting in the States or in the UK. Professors are sent away. Their contracts are not renewed. I'm not saying that it should be done here. Am I displaced? But here we are public servants. I mean, we work in public. We entered in a competition in order to 3 days of tests and exams in order to get it to our jobs, and we have our rights, and more so, we have our rights to be part of unions. And unions are spaces to make sure that the university is ethical, is just, that the university is a place of really transforming people's lives, not only in terms of their grades and in terms of experiments and all of that, but in terms of becoming a different human being. The World Social Forum speaks about a different world is possible. This is the case. These are prime examples where we can do that. The same applies for students. The students are protected by law in terms of their ability to be autonomous and to express themselves. I know that pressures take place, and they did. We received, for example, many emails, unknown emails. Some people were harassed in more serious ways and all of that. But I think rallying together, working together, making sure that the whole process is institutionalized, in my view, including these emails that one receives, is a way of gaining density. You need density. It's not possible to build on something when it is sporadic, when it is responsive or reactive, and not one that is founded on a clear line of, in a persistent way, making sure that the theme or the subject or the issue is alive and that it's remembered, because memory is something very important. We see atrocities literally every day this past period, including children and women, elderly, women inside her house in Jenin camp, getting ready to pray and was shot. And so we live in this bogus of the world, people being bombarded with images and things like that. And so we have to be really selective and, in a pondered way, really come through and build on solidarity and robustness of the Palestinian question, and how important it is also to other issues in the world, other themes and other questions.
Absolutely. I think this is also related to the importance of the presence of you professors talking to us in these times, to make it institutional and to try to bring the subject into our discussions in the Forbidden Academy, and try to do our own approaches, because exactly it is like we cannot surrender to the pressure that many of us face, and this is absolutely important. And also, this is, I think, it's a personal, of course, a personal position. I think this is one of the things that informs the lack of the approaches that we can potentially make with the Palestinians institutionally and in our research. Like I imagine how many good ideas were denied from the very beginning just because of boycott of potential supervisors that don't agree with the project and this and that. So it's complicated, but it's very important in this sense to have you here. Well, I think this was the last question that we took to make. I just would like to comment. Andrea, she asked about the community, Palestinian community in Shui, and she mentioned the thesis, and there's some other articles also of Denise Jacquin. And she was one of the pioneers working with the Palestinian community in Brazil. Yes. And
there's a wealth of production, isn't there? Rafael writes on Palestine all the time. He's obsessed with Palestine. But also he lives Palestine, right, Rafael?
I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm here working. And yeah, it's important. It's important to have these approaches. I think that's it. And well, I would like to thank you very much, Moon, again, for your presence, for your lecture. We are having also again Professor Eileen, and so thank you very much. It was a pleasure, inspiring as always, and yeah, I hope to see you again very soon.
Yes, me too. In Ramallah, inshallah. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Arlene. It's always
No,
good to hear
it
from
was really our pleasure, Mona. And Rafael, thank you very much for mediating and of course getting in touch with Mona and all this. Um, I'd like to remind everyone that the course continues. Next Thursday, our class will be about South translations. So the topic continues of thinking about the insertion and repercussion and the consequences of this insertion of Arab culture in Brazil, and how the movement back also happens, of translating Portuguese back into Arabic also. So that's what we're going to talk about next class. Mona, I'd like to thank you very much for bringing all these articles that you quoted, all this work that you and Pepao and your colleagues have been doing to think about, to reflect about the Palestinian diaspora in Brazil, which is not a large diaspora, but it is significant. And it is part of our universities, of our communities, of our culture in so many ways. So I'd like to ask if you have any final words.
I'm sorry, if I have what you were
Any
asking?
final words to close this?
Yes, I was thanking you for the opportunity, and it's always like that, isn't it? I mean, we venture into a theme and we think we know how to work it, and then all of a sudden you discover more and more things. And so it was an enjoyable experience for me, very profound. I learned many things as well in the interaction and constructing together this. I want to congratulate you once again on this initiative. I think it's very, very important. I'm very happy to be making the bridge, if you like. This is what I noted looking at the themes. So I'm making the bridge into another, let's say, thematic axis, if you like, issue, right? Thematic line into this. So I'm very happy. I always follow the activities. And, anytime I'm here, let's partner. Anything you want, we can do, and we do it good.
Yes, this class is certainly a bridge. That's right, Mona. If you think about the organization of this course. And it also reflects the main interest that our colleagues had at meetings in State University, for example. Their main interest was to know about the Palestinian diaspora in Brazil. Now, the Palestinians in Palestine know very little about the Palestinian diaspora here in Brazil, and they're really eager to get in touch and to get to interact more with this community. And I always tell them that, yeah, there's the Palestinian diaspora that is very relevant, but also what is might be surprising for these colleagues in universities in Palestine is the repercussions and how Palestine resounds in Brazilian circles that are not of Palestinian origin. No? So this is the second aspect that I think you also brought in your class. Yeah, so thank you very much. And yeah, thank you. And next Thursday we meet again.